Welcome to One Bad Podcast. Here's your hosts, KD and Shaner.
KD, how you doing, buddy?
What is up, my friend?
Oh man, this is cool. This is awesome.
Love it. We're making history here.
Well, hey, I'm gonna jump right in, dude, because I'm excited. We've been talking about doing this podcast for a while now, so I'm gonna jump right in with how we're gonna frame this whole thing. This is our 20th year. Can you believe that? That's some crazy shit. 20 years. So I'm gonna jump right in to the middle of the story, kind of the height of the story, to be honest. And I want to just jump into the 2018 tour. We're out going across America with Sebastian Bach. And at that point, we have a #1 single. We've got, how many hits? How many top fives at that point? Top fives, top tens. We're playing sold out shows across Canada. We got our faces on buses in Saskatoon. We've opened for Def Leppard, Judas Priest. Like, we are probably in 2018, I would say, like, that's everything we had really worked for, and it was happening. And then the big thing was we tried to break into the US forever. And now we're on like a tour that started in Denver, down to Texas, up to Maine, New York, back down to Florida. Like, we were out for a long time. And it was probably, I'd say from the outside looking in, like, here's a band we did it. We made it. We're doing it, you know? And so I think from the outside looking in, that's what that looks like. I know bands were messaging me and people were stoked and just like happy that we'd finally done it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you where you were at, like, in your mind, in your heart at that moment.
Yeah, well, great question, dude. What a great intro question to jump into. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it was like the height of our career in a lot of ways, but weirdly enough, I feel like it was a low point in terms of like as a band, like, you know, as our vibe, our relationship as a band, you know. And I mean, there's some great things happen on that tour for sure. Like some were great shows, some of the best shows of our career, you know. But I also felt like we were just, honestly, what I feel when I think of that, putting myself back in that van, you know, is just like just being totally burnt out, you know. And part of that was, and obviously that's what we'll dig into, is like what it takes to get to that level as a band. I mean, it almost tore us apart. And I think it did. OBS came this close to breaking up, you know?
Yeah.
And so absolutely. I think I just feel exhausted if I put myself back there, and sort of burnt out. And I think we needed to sort of step back, and we did after that, right? I mean, that was sort of the beginning of a new chapter. But yeah,
I'm glad you said that. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, man. Because I felt exactly the same way, and I honestly think everybody did. And it was like, it's a cool way to start this podcast because it is. We've always felt like that. I think about our favorite bands. Like, no matter what height of success, you think like, oh, they did it. Like they're doing it. You know, when we started out, I'd look around at bands, you know, even like bigger Canadian bands like the Tea Party, and that's what you want. You know, you're on tour, you've got songs on the radio, like everything's popping off. But once we got there, I mean, you said it exactly right, where it's like you kind of have these two things in your mind at the same time, where you are elated, you're pumped. It's like, you know, because I remember at that moment we had just played 3 shows in the US before that tour too. I think in 3 shows we played to a grand total of like 6 people. And so now we got this like cross America tour, and we asked for it, you know, and we got it, and we had all the success, but at the same time, and I wish we had the language to talk to each other about it at that moment, but I was the same, burned out. Like, and I really look back, I mean, after that tour was the sickest I've ever been. Like, I got home and it was like all those years of work and stress, and like, especially the stress of that last record, I just came apart physically, you know, mentally. It just burned right out. So I'm glad you said that, because you're feeling like so excited and so like we're finally doing this thing, and on the other hand, you're like, I'm honestly like I might be ready to throw in the towel. Like I'm burned right out.
I didn't realize. So you were like physically sick when you got home. I forgot that.
Yeah, it was, dude. I've never actually experienced that. I got home, I slept for about 3 days, and then my body just, and once I kind of, really thought about it, I'm like, well, of course, you hold in all of that stress and all of those things, and like it's going to come out physically at some point. And we're going to get into probably a lot of stories, but touring is not what everybody really feels like it probably is. Like, how many times have we been asked, like, out like backstage, it must be crazy, like hanging out with, name the people that we've played with and opened for, the Stones, everyone thinks there's this like thing going on around behind the scenes, but truly, like, driving in the van 20 hours a day, sometimes between shows, like sleeping for 40 minutes. I don't know how many times we got 40-minute sleeps between, a 20-hour drive, a show, sell merch, go to bed, get up, all over again. I mean, you're just burning out probably more than you ever realize until really years later, right?
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, and maybe if you get to that, like on this example, if you're at Sebastian Bach's level, you're the headliner, things are way easier, right? Like it's the artists on the way up, the opening acts that really have to, burn the midnight oil, right? Because remember, he could go to his bus and party all night, and then the driver would drive him all night to the next city, right? Where we'd have to drive ourselves in a van to the next city. So while we get 40 minutes sleep and then drive 10 hours, he just sleeps on the bus and wakes up. And you're right. And I think that's the whole, I look back at those days and I'm so thankful that none of us, got into like, none of us got into the bad stuff, the bad shit, right? Like none of us developed, drug issues, or we all pretty balanced with alcohol, et cetera. But it's those kind of, when you're burning the candle at both ends, that's when people get hooked on bad shit, right? And I'm so thankful none of us did, because then that would just be, that's why so many bands never have a chance of making it, because you describe all the things you described and then add like drug addictions, and then you're really screwed, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because obviously, like, so many bands, not until you're touring to the degree we were out on the road, you realize why, like, all these guys like Johnny Cash, Elvis, like going way back, they were all hooked on speed and all those things first, really, before other drugs, because it was like, I need to stay awake. Like, because, the most important thing when you're on tour is that you put on a good show. Like, every fucking night's got to be, and especially in a tour like that Bach tour, it was all brand new people. So every night, like, you're bringing it all the time, but you're always breaking new ground. So that, like, no matter what's going on personally, once you hit the stage, like, you have to have energy. You've got to have the whole thing, and you got to just, like, everything that you do in a day has to go into that moment. So you're just living for that, right? And you can understand why stuff like speed and cocaine and all those things start coming in for bands, because first and foremost, you're just trying to get up for the show. And then, of course, that can, when that stuff is more and more free all the time, I mean, that's it's a whole other side of our industry probably that doesn't get talked about in that way. But yeah, totally. You're right, man. The headliners have it a little bit easier, but even them, you're still away from family. You're still like bigger you get, the more on the road you are. And it's like, it's always some version of that, whether you're in a little van or you're touring in cars together to multiple tour buses, like life on the road is life on the road, right?
Yeah, and that's you're right, that's a whole other, we never had, I always joked in the early days that, well, I mean, actually through our entire career, we never made enough money to develop cocaine habits, but, but you're right. Once you become Elton John, or, I mean, all these stories, of course, I mean, all of our idols, when they become mega stars, like that's a whole other realm of living, right? It's a different reality, right? When you're Freddie Mercury, I mean, that's a different world, right? But you're right. It's easier. You've got limos and buses, but you're more money, more problems, as they say. So, anyways, I as far as the OBS story, I'm so grateful that we got through that and, came out the other end, with our lives intact and the train, we got the train rolling again, which is, to me, a minor miracle, I would say,
Yeah, absolutely, dude. That's a good way to put it. Minor to almost major miracle that we're still here and doing it. And it's cool because to set up how we're doing this podcast, which is like, we're starting here diving into the middle, and then we can rewind all the way back, right? Like we'll set that up in a minute or two here, but this is also it's a cool moment for us to talk as a band that has been incredibly successful, honestly, especially as a Canadian band, right? Like we have had number one hits. We've had all these things that so many bands never get. And I think that people kind of associate, like you're talking about Freddie Mercury and Elton John, like they associate, I've heard people have asked me like, oh, you guys got houses now and cars. And I'm like, I don't know what year you think it is, but it's a cool thing to unpack though, because not only is the reality for bands like ours, and there's many bands like our size, bands that we played with a lot, like Monster Truck, and that do great things, but they're not like us. Like it doesn't come with mansions, and it doesn't come with all this expendable cash, and that's partially the misconception of how music works for the artists in general, which is another great, like you mentioned, this podcast is cool for us to sit and chat about 20 years in this industry and 20 years as friends and writers and all the things. But it's also our era of music. We started in 2004 and it was a strange time. And like the more we've gone on, the more I realize how strange that time was, right? Like we're already starting the digital era, right? Like Napster and all that shit had already happened. So we're out of the old industry when we started. We're already out of that. But the new industry isn't there. Like there isn't Spotify. There's, actually when we started, like there's not even Facebook. There's not Instagram.
Yeah.
So it's cool to frame our story too in the time that it's taken place, because it was, I mean, we're going to get into your other career as a entertainment lawyer too, because you're seeing the music industry develop over this 20 years, right? And so it is also the fact that money isn't what it used to be. Radio's not what it used to be. All these things that for artists for like generations were like known quantities, right? Get a hit on the radio, boom, that's money, that's royalties, like that's bigger tours. Those things were off the table for us, honestly, kind of from day one, because the industry didn't know where it was. It absolutely didn't know where it was going. So it's also a cool way to frame our story, but also to illustrate for bands starting right now, right? Like what you have to do, like what the through lines for any band that's ever started in any era are, and then what's different about our era, which was, dude, it was a crazy time to start a band, and we'll say that,
I know. I feel like we missed out on, like, obviously both being big fans of the 90s rock and roll, and like 90s was the whole thing, and then which was obviously had pros and cons, but like focus on the pros, like the mainstream record industry was still there, right? Like people were still buying CDs, and I was paying $30 a CD for whatever, and we missed out on that. And then but we're too early for like to really take advantage of. There's no, you said, no Spotify, no Instagram,
no
Facebook.
Streaming. Yeah.
So we couldn't just, we didn't have the old model. We couldn't benefit from the new model either. So it's like it was just this weird middle ground, right? And this weird time. And also musically speaking, it was a weird time because I remember 2004 when we started. It's like, I mean, Nickelback and Default and all that stuff, and
we just got out of the Limp Bizkit era. You know what I mean? Like
just got out of it, yeah. and we weren't. Everyone was all about the Theory of a Dead Man, that kind of sound, which we weren't clearly. And so it's just like, I mean, I guess the one thing that I'm proud of is that through all those, from when we started 2004, all the different trends that emerged, we never followed the trends because I don't think we could have if we wanted to, but we didn't want to. So we never chased trends in mainstream rock or whatever, just did our thing, and eventually we found our sound. But I always tell this to young bands. I'm like, it took us 8 years to get to find our sound, really. And when I say find our sound, I mean find a sound that actually resonates with a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
We had a sound before. I would say we had a great. We had all the ingredients. We just had shitty recipes, So we found the right recipe, but it took us 8 years, Whereas in today's world, like an artist starts, I tell them it might take you 8 years to find your recipe, and they look at me like their eyes just glaze over. They're like, "What? I got 8 months, bro."
Well, man, and I love that because I remember we got told that, and when you're when you're starting a band and somebody is like, oh, get back to me in a year, let's see where you guys are at. You're like, oh, dude, like if we don't make it in 6 months, like we're done. Like that's an eternity. But you're right. You look back, and that 8 years, every day felt like an eternity. But then you look back on it, and it goes by in a flash, right? I mean, that's life. And we're hitting our time limit for this first episode, and this is actually a cool place to leave off because next episode we're gonna go back to the beginning. Now we started at 2018. We're gonna rewind. We're gonna work our way up, and then we're gonna talk about obviously everything that happened from 2018 to now, pandemic, everything else, and we've got new music happening, and I can't wait to get to that part. But I also don't want to rush this thing. So next episode, we're going to talk influences. We don't need to share our entire life story, but I think starting with, we got into music for a reason. It was because you and I have things that we cross when it comes to Pearl Jam and AIC and that, but we have a wide range of things that brought us into music in the first place. So what do you say we talk about that in episode 2?
Love it, dude. Let's do it.
All right.
Thanks for listening to One Bad Podcast.